I said in the beginning that we'd be talking about gauge, and here we are. In this video, I will be teaching you about gauge and tension, and I'll show you some tips for bringing your crocheting to the next level. So, let's define our terms. Gauge is the number of stitches per inch and rows per inch that result from a specified yarn worked with a specified size hook. So, if you'll remember, on our yarn label, this is the box that indicates gauge. And what it's telling us is that if you use this specific yarn and a 5mm size hook, if you single crochet 13 stitches for 14 rows, you will end up with a square 4 inches by 4 inches. That can help you if you're deciding what yarn to use for a pattern. Now, everybody crochets differently, and so their finished gauge might not match this yarn label. For example, in our single crochet coaster, my gauge for 4 inches by 4 inches was 12 stitches for 13 rows instead of 13 stitches for 14 rows. And your gauge probably is different as well. Pattern makers include a gauge in their pattern so that you, when you're at home crocheting, can match the gauge so that your finished product will match theirs. And the finished gauge is all determined by tension. I know I've used the word tension a lot, so let's talk about what it means in crochet. The tension is just how tightly or loosely you are holding your yarn while you crochet. And it affects the height, width, stiffness, everything like that of your finished work is all determined here by how you hold your yarn. This is a swatch I made to show you what can happen when your tension changes during a project. Here at the bottom, it goes from a very loose tension to an average to a tight tension. You can see that the rows are getting shorter and the sides are angling in. As the tension gets tighter, the stitches are getting smaller. Also, the corners are curling. At the bottom, they're curling because I chained the first chain using my average tension and then intentionally crocheted very loosely in the first row. So that difference in tension is what's pulling it up. Up top, the corners are curling because the tension is too tight for the size of this yarn and the size of the hook. There's not enough space for the yarn, so it's pulling in on itself and curling. Another thing to keep in mind, when the stitches are tight, the finished fabric is stiff. See, it doesn't have a lot of give up top, and then in the middle, you got a bit more, and at the bottom, it actually stretches out quite a bit. Sometimes you want a very tight fabric or a very loose fabric, but generally speaking, it's best to aim for an average tension. So, how do we do that? First, ask yourself, are you a yanker, rider, or lifter? These all refer to the first loop you pull up after you've inserted the hook through a stitch. So, if you're a yanker, that means that you pull back on the yarn when you pull up your first loop. Or after you finish a stitch, if you pull back, yank back, like this. Pull it up, pull back, pull through. Also, if you keep your hook angled down like this and then pull up, that's another thing that happens. And this will lead to a tight tension. If you're a lifter, that means that you pull the first loop up higher and pull it through, like this. Now this can happen when your yarn is flowing too easily, too quickly through your hands, or as you're learning and trying to maneuver the hook, it can just pull up higher than normal sometimes. And you can see even just between here and here the difference. So it's generally speaking, advisable to be a rider. A rider is someone who keeps their hook parallel to the work. See, it's sort of like the hook is riding this line right here, and then you pull through. You just ride the line so it's parallel and then pull through. This keeps your stitch heights even between them, and the sides of your project will end up even as well. Also, your finished project is most likely to match the pattern's finished dimensions. It's not a guarantee. If the person who made the pattern was a yanker, then you'll have to crochet tighter to more perfectly match. Or alternatively, you could try a smaller hook than the recommended size to compensate for not pulling as tight. So, for a real-world example, I was crocheting a project and it said the gauge with a 3.25 millimeter hook would be 24 double crochets and 13 rows. But you see, my finished square is 4.5 inches wide and nearly 5 inches tall, which is not what the pattern calls for. So I went for a smaller hook, a 2.75 millimeter hook, which is only 0.5 millimeter smaller. And I ended up with a square that is now just about 4 inches wide. A pinch wider, but close enough. However, the height is pretty much the same. It's 4 3/4 of an inch, which is 3/4 of an inch higher than it should be. So I redid it, and all I did to get my new square, which is 4 inches by just over 4 inches. You can see I still missed the mark just a bit, but it's the closest I got. And all I did was pull back on the yarn after each stitch. That little bit of yanking changed the finished height that much. I know that can seem daunting, but if you test the gauge first, practice with the yarn and the size hook, you can get it. And your pieces are going to turn out so much cleaner and look so professional. It's going to look so great. So I hope these tips have helped you as much as these tips helped me, and I can't wait to see you next lesson. And I'll show you some tips for bringing your crocheter, not crocheter. In this video, Sarah, get it together. Mine is slightly different than that, you'll notice. Or else, no, okay. What can happen when your tension changes? That is not the right segue. Hi.